Welcome, and we will start, of course, with a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So we're continuing where we left off. We just got started, and oops, I don't know why that's doing that. All right. I don't know what that was. All right. So I guess we were here. So God was speaking to Noah, was telling him stuff, right? And then we now went into Gam Me'of Hashanayim. So we talked about the cattle and the wild beasts, and that the pure ones, there were going to be 7 pairs of pure animals, of clean, I don't know what to say clean, pure animals. And we discussed the fact that pure meant that they would be placed, that they could be placed on the altar in future time. So what's interesting is that he also mentions Gam Me'of Hashamayim, also from the birds of the heavens, Shiva Shiva. 7, 7, in other words, 7 pairs, Zachar Unkeva. And here he says, he doesn't say Ish ve'ishto. He says male and female. Lechayot zera al pnei kol haaretz. In order to, and even though Chai, we know that Chaim means to live, to cause to live would be the way to understand this. It probably is an abbreviated form of Lahachayot, which is hifil, causative. And I felt that the word sustain was a good word here. To sustain seed on the surface of the entire earth. Okay, that's trying to translate this as literally as I can. Let's take a look at the Rashi here. Right. So, Gam Me'of Hashamayim. So notice, by the way, please, before I even get into the Rashi here, because he's going to pick up on that really. Do you notice something is missing here in this sentence? Is there something that's jumping out that's missing? It doesn't say Torah. It doesn't mention anything about pure, about the birds being pure in this sentence. Just talks about the birds, right? So Rashi picks that up right away, and he says, "But tahorim hakatuv medaber." Scripture is speaking about those birds that were pure. And incidentally, even though it doesn't say it explicitly, there were only 2 species, and they're actually subspecies of one species of bird that was actually sacrificed, that was actually involved in sacrifice. And guess what bird that would be?
Chicken?
Doves or pigeons. Doves or pigeons. So in a way, is there a certain anticipation here where the Torah is being extremely literary here? So Rashi is saying we should understand that the Torah is only referring to pure species. So now, tahor, there are many species of birds that are kosher, that are considered tahor. But if tahor means here that they are able to be placed on the altar, then that would be what we're talking about. And I think that from a literary standpoint, that is significant. That the bird that returns to that brings the olive branch is the dove. It's a guess. It's not. It's simply there. It's just simply suggestive. Yes.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I cannot understand how a lion and a lamb could go together, because a lion would eat that lamb up. I mean, he brings in these wild animals, and how can they separate like that unless God says, no, I'm going to let them be, tamed until they get out again, and then they can go their normal way. But I just can't
Okay,
understand.
so there are a few possibilities to answer your good question. Okay, one possibility is that there were different chambers for each animal. They weren't just one big group mass of animals, but that in fact we were told earlier on that he was to make chambers for this ark. Okay, kinim ta'aseh. But it could be that you know I think that, or kanim, and a cane is like a nest, right? So that it's quite probable that they were separate chambers for each animal. And again, I want to be careful about being overly literal over this from these passages, and to understand that there's an overall point to be made here in this particular story. And it's not history. Okay, it's not what it's supposed to be. It's literary. It's telling us truths that are literary truths, meaning, human reality truths, and not from a historical point of view. So that's one possibility. Also, and I know that I wanted to share this with you, what was the diet of human beings at this particular time? What is
Vegetarian.
Right, they were all
Vegetarian.
vegetarian, right. So the possibility is, this is another answer, that at this particular time, all the animals were vegetarian as well. It's possible. I'm not saying it's definite. I'm just simply saying that since human beings were vegetarians, it's quite possible that animals were vegetarians as well. That's another answer to your question. All right? So,
One
but
more
the
question.
easiest answer is that yeah, okay, I'll take it in a second. The easiest answer is simply that they were placed in separate chambers. Okay, but yes, go ahead.
The question is, did he bring seeds into the ark? I mean, what about the trees? The trees bear fruit. If the trees were destroyed by the flood, there
Yes.
would be no trees. He must have brought seed into the
Okay.
to plant again.
Okay, very good. So it's a good question. So it certainly appears, and we would have to say this from the story itself. Your question is a great question, but the fact that after the flood subsides and the ark is there for a period of time, what does the dove do? The dove brings an olive branch. So clearly the seeds of the trees did not perish in the flood.
Oh,
Otherwise, because Noah certainly never had an opportunity to plant an olive tree, okay, he never went out the ark. So there's your indication that the vegetation, plant life, survived the flood.
okay.
All right. So, but it's a great question. The other question, of course, that you might ask is, how about the fish, right? Because
Yeah,
okay, well, of course, fish survive in water, but there is
yeah.
suggestion elsewhere that the waters were boiling, okay, and that fish wouldn't be able to survive in those. But from what we know, Noah did not take fish. All right, so there has to be, again, when we take midrashim or because it's a midrash, that again we have to understand that the way this operates is a far more literary kind of way than necessarily the kind of literature that we read in general. That this is a particular kind of literature, and again, you know that the idea is that a novel is it's fiction. It's fiction. So why do we read fiction if it isn't the truth? Because there is truth that lies behind stuff that may on its surface be fictitious, and yet that very same stuff may bear for it, truths about human life, of thought and reality, etc., etc. And I think we have to understand the Torah in this particular way too. Does it mean there never was a Noah, there never was any relationship? Well, there certainly may have been something like that, but the truth is, trying to piece this together so that that it bears historical truth, I think is going in the wrong direction, and I think ultimately you lose the value of it because it doesn't hold up well to it. Example, by the way, if they ever discover an ark that looks like the pictures that we've all seen of arks, which have a stem and a stern, I would say that's a fictitious ark. The Torah itself uses the term teva. Here it is. There's the word teva. And the word teva in other contexts means nothing but a box, a container. Okay? And again, I've made this point many times, which is the reason why you put a stem and a stern on a boat is because you want it to go from point A to point B. Noah wasn't going from point A to point B. He only wanted to go in one direction, and that was up. Okay? Now, whether the stem and the stern give the boat more stability, etc., that may be a different issue. But whether it is more stable because it is shaped like that or not, I am just not in any position to comment on. but I know it's made that way so as to go in a particular direction. All
I
right.
got
So,
one more.
well,
Okay.
I have a question too.
Yes.
So, oh, sorry, Lisa, maybe you want to go first.
No, go ahead. You can go ahead. Go ahead.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, David. I've been trying to interject. It can be difficult at times. So the thing about Harlan that you brought about the lion and the lamb, I was thinking also that there's, if the lion and the lamb are laying down together, then there's hope and there is peace. Where there might be strife, there is peace. And so that was a lovely thought that occurred to me. And also with the seeds, I had never thought of that before. But also with many of the species, a lot of times they live in the animals that ingest them. And then through the compost later, they survive and they germinate. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's
So,
good.
so
Very good.
yeah. So what I
I
was
got
going to
another
ask, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I got another question.
Okay, Harlan, before you ask, can
Can I
you
go
look
first, Harlan?
Go
Oh.
ahead. Go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So,
Go ahead.
Rab, I think that the other question I have is what you're saying about the, looking at this, not necessarily at the historical context, but, going in the wrong direction that way. Is that really more like we're just looking at this in terms of taking maybe poetic license so that, we look at what the overall results are as opposed to trying to separate this out from a historical perspective and everything making sense from that point of view, right? So that's the concept, right? Like you said, we read fiction, because there's a purpose associated with the story. So we really have to give the fact that there's poetic license here, right? And allow that to happen. Is that correct?
So I don't know that I necessarily use the term poetic license, but I think I understand what you're saying, what the point is that you're trying to make. Yes, it's speaking in metaphor, and I think just simply understanding it as literature is just so much more helpful. I want to say one more thing. We so live in a Western civilization soup. Okay, we breathe it in and we breathe it out. The legacy that the Greeks left us is absolutely incredible when you think of how long it's lasted. Okay, that Greek civilization continues in various ways. You look at sports, for example, and drama and theater and the arts and all that. It's all Greek civilization stuff. Okay. And Hebrew civilization isn't Greek civilization. By the way, I would have to tell you very truthfully, so much of the Talmud and stuff like that borrows very heavily from Greek civilization as well. Okay, there are many Greek words that find themselves into Rabbinic Hebrew as well. Having said that, the very concept of history, I know, we can laugh at Henry Ford who said history is bunk, okay? But, getting away from the crassness of that statement, trying to actually reconstruct history is not a small thing. And the truth is that any responsible historian going all the way back to, say, Roman times and the great Roman historians, all, at least at the very beginning of their work, mention the basis on which they are writing this history. What is the nature of the validity of what they're saying? Because inevitably, it's a filtering process. You cannot simply, history is not the reconstruction of reality, of every single fact involved. But it is a way of using certain criteria to link certain things together and to see a certain causality, I believe. I'm not a historian, but at least as far as I've thought about these things, that's the way I would understand it. The Bible isn't attempting to be a history. But, we bring this historical category because we feel that it's such a how can I put it, a valid way to look at this material. And it isn't. And it doesn't hold up. And so what happens is, because it doesn't hold up to, whatever it is in the back of our minds that we assume makes something historical, we get disappointed and we throw this on the trash heap. We ignore it. We think it's not worth reading. On the other hand, if you look at it as great literature, that's a different story. Then it holds up very, very well, and you can read it many, many times and derive new ideas, etc. You know, some of,
I,
I don't know that King Lear may have been a historical figure, but the play King Lear by Shakespeare isn't, it may be about the issues of what happened, but it has more to do with issues of loyalty and filial behavior and human greed and stuff like that than anything else. Then whether or not King Lear ever existed as a person is kind of irrelevant. King Lear exists because we can read about him and his family. And King Lear is a fabulous play.
yeah, it is. It was, yeah. I have one more question.
Sure.
If the flood, the ark was made for the flood, what happened during the 10 generations? I'm sure that other people had boats too. They must have built their boats too, and the ark wasn't the only one. There must have been other people. After 10 generations, surely somebody would have built a boat.
Again, ask yourself, how are you trying to look at this? How are you filtering it? You're trying to filter it through legitimate sort of historical or cultural kinds of ways. This is a story. Okay, and as legitimate as your question is from one perspective, from the perspective of the story, which we talked about briefly yesterday, right? That I told you that I was trying to think about, extrapolate, what is the story really about? And is it really about how we as human beings have such responsibility as to the care and management of this planet Earth? That it's really about that. And how profound our effect is, because you have human beings corrupting their ways, basically destroying the world, okay? And you have a family that isn't going to do that is going to respond to a divine command. And again, that bears further discussion as to what are we talking about, because I think if I were to try and say it in a brief kind of way, responding to divine command is trying to respond to what we feel is the voice of creation, of the ultimate purpose of why we're here to begin with, and trying to figure that out and trying to hear those voices. And here they are, able to let the world survive. Now we know that the story of Noah is found in other Mesopotamian tracts, okay? There's literature that's been discovered from that period, and there are parallels. There's a Babylonian parallel to the story of Noah, but it doesn't make the same point as this particular story, which is carved in a unique way in terms of how do we respond to our place as human beings, understanding just how much effect we have on the world around us. So that's what I think. Okay. Yes. Right, Golda. Golda mentions that there are many cultures that have flood stories. So you have to go back and say, what is it trying to say? What are those flood stories trying to say? I mean, here it's, I think we're being told how responsible we are. There's some more stuff if we can get to it. I don't know that we'll get to it today, but about God's relationship to the world. In fact, there's a reference back to Genesis, which I bookmarked it because there's a reference to it. So let me see. I don't know that we'll get to it today, but perhaps this week we will. Okay, so let's see. So we were saying that when we were talking about the birds and how we're talking about the pure birds. Just to finish this off, V'lamad satum min hamaforash. And this verse, you learn out how to interpret. In other words, he's giving us a principle of biblical interpretation, and that is that you learn out the hidden from the explicit. So the previous verse explicitly talked about pure animals. And even though this verse doesn't talk about pure animals, we understand that that's what it's referring to. And that's a very important principle of interpretation. Okay. So let's go on. Ki layamim, this is God still speaking to Noah, right? Ki layamim od shiva, because in another 7 days, anochi mamtir al haaretz, I will cause rain to fall on the land. Arba'im yom, or on the earth, Arba'im yom, 40 days, for Arba'im laila, and 40 nights. And there is a significance to the 40 clearly. And we'll see what our tradition says is the significance. Umachiti, and I will blot out, I will wipe out, et kol hayakum, all existence, asher asiti, which I made. By the way, this, it could have ended kol hayakum, but the fact that God adds these two words, that the Torah adds these two words, which I made, adds a certain poignancy to the fact that here we have divine creation, and creation being such a disappointment, to the point where God wants to destroy it, doesn't want to tolerate anymore. May al pnei ha'adama, and this is off the face of the of the land, or the of the earth, right? So aretz, land, eretz, land, adama, earth, something like that, because there is a distinction. Let's take a look and see what he says here. This could be where this is where I made the reference. That's the reference. Okay, so ki liyamim od shiva, because in another 7 days. So got 1 week to go, right, before this all starts. So he says, look at this. This is just lovely from Sanhedrin Kufchet, from the tractate Sanhedrin, page 108. Elu shiva yemei evlo shel mitushelach hatzadik. These 7 days are the 7 days of mourning for Methuselah, the righteous. Shechas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because the Holy One, blessed be He, took pity, al kvodo, regarding His honor. Ve'ikev et hapuranut, and He delayed the punishment, period. Se v'chashov, if you go, Rashi says, if you go out and figure out, calculate, shnotav shel metushelach, and you figure out Methuselah's years, the timsa, you will discover, shehem kalin bishnat shesh ma'ot shana l'chayei Noach. You will see that they end in the 600th year of Noah's life. And it says explicitly that Noah was 600 years old. You can actually create a table of the years, because it tells you how long they were before they had a child, right? How old they were, and then it says how much longer they lived beyond that. And you can set up a table and see who was alive when certain people were born. Okay, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward table. You just have to set it up. Okay. Ki liyamim od, for in another, in several more days, right? Another, in this case, 7 days. Mahu od. So why do we have this word od, another? What's another coming to tell us? Zman achar zman. Okay, so he says this is a period of time following a period of time. Ze nosaf. Okay. This is a period of time added al me'ah ve'esrim shana, on the 120 years. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes.
were the people warned on those 7 days that they were going to be destroyed? I mean, God destroyed the good people along with the evil people. I don't understand that either.
Rashi says that earlier on. He says when things get to a certain point, okay, the good die along with the bad. It's called, in Greek, there's a Greek word for this, androlomusia. And we had dealt with this last year. Yeah. Androlomusia ba'la olam. So the good, unfortunately, perish with the bad, when there are enough bad. Yeah. It just gets to a point where you can't, I mean, remember, there were 10 generations, and this started with the generation of Enosh, right? The 3rd generation after Adam is where this all started, where human beings started to behave this way. Okay. All right. So I wanted to go back to Genesis 6:3 because how do we get this 120? And I'm going to go, let's see if I can go to, see, bookmarks. Yeah, let's go into the bookmarks. And here we are. So this was very nice. I appreciated this very much about, so let's hide the sidebar for a second. And here, let's see, here's the verse. This is after people start, all this stuff starts happening at the end of Genesis, right? The first section of Genesis. Vayomer Hashem, so God said, Lo yadon ruchi ba'adam, my spirit will no longer strive with man. Remember, you got these people living all 900 years, right, at a time. La'olam will not strive forever with man. Beshagam hu basar, inasmuch as he is also flesh. And we need Rashi to explain the point of that. And here's the payoff. Vahayu yamav, let his days be me'ah ve'esrim shana, 120 years. So it's at this point, by the way, right at the end of Genesis, that human life shrinks down to 120 years. And I know I'm going to take a while here, or take a moment to say that the fact that these people who are living in excess of 900 years, people have tried to, again, rationalize this out by saying, well, maybe it's not talking about years, it's really talking about months, etc., etc. Here is your proof that the Torah is speaking about years. It's saying, again, understanding the Torah as a literary creation, that there is a point that's being made from a literary point of view when the Torah talks about all these people lasting over 900 years, and not a single one lives to 1,000. And we have, of course, in Psalm 90, 1,000 years in your sight is like a day that is passed, like a watch in the night. So the issue is mortality.
Rabbi, why did God just pick 120 years?
It's a good question, and I don't know that I necessarily know how to answer that question. But apparently, there probably is a good answer to that question, Harlan. But I must admit, I am stumped. I do not know specifically why God chose 120, but I imagine it is a significance to it.
Moses
And maybe,
lived 100,
yes, he did.
Moses lived 120 years, and he was vibrant. He was still good.
Yes,
Moses
right.
lived 120. He could have lived longer.
Right. So, yeah. You know that there was a woman in our congregation, Elsie Rich, who lived to 110. That is how long Joseph wrote. In the Bible, Joseph lived to 110. I think Joshua did too. But she lived to 110. And she was fully, fully cognizant, etc., etc. So anyway,
Wow.
I don't know. I think part of it, something that's sort of occurring to me is possibly that it's 3 sets of 40 years apiece, that it has to do with certain generations and being able to see. I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much. I'd rather see if someone else comments on it. Okay, so here we go. Here. Lo yadun ruchi misha. So we're still dealing now with how long God can tolerate how, human behavior, okay, and we'll see what he says, okay? So he explains, Lo yitraem v'yariv ruchi. So it's God speaking about himself and saying that he is not going, yitraem is like to experience pain and anger and stuff like that. V'yariv, and to contend my spirit. In other words, what he's saying is that he is fighting with himself, in a way, right? Alai, upon me, bishvil hanak adam, on
Where
account
did
of
you
the man.
go to?
Gimel. Oh, I went to chapter 6, verse 3.
So okay, so you're skipping ahead a little bit.
No, I was picking back. I went back because it mentioned
I mean,
100.
you're going back. Okay,
Yes.
okay,
I went back because Rashi mentioned 120,
okay,
and I wanted to go back to that original 120 where
okay,
it
so you're
happened.
still back, okay.
So what God is saying is, I can only wrestle with myself so long. In other words, do I allow human beings to survive? Do I punish them? How do I deal with them? Right? That's what I'm catching from this. Okay. Le'olam. This means forever. But he says it's not forever. It's le'orech yamim, for a long period of time. Hine ruchi nadon birkibi. Rashi is sort of extrapolating here, trying to understand or help us understand what is God saying here, right? And he says, Hine ruchi nadon birkibi. He says, my spirit is adjudicating in my heart. It's just trying to figure this out. Im lahashchit, whether or not to destroy, ve'im lerachem, or to show mercy. Lo yeh madon ze beruchi leolam. I am not going to tolerate this contention in my spirit forever. Klomar, that is to say, laorech yamim, right? For a lengthy period of time. So that what this is, the grand metaphor that the Torah is giving us here is that when human beings behave in abominable kinds of ways, okay, and what we think is abominable may not, may be well beyond what God thinks is abominable, right? I mean, there are levels of behavior: cheating, stealing, lying, that kind of thing. So he says, and whenever that happens, it creates a certain, you might, if we wanted to use other kinds of metaphors, a certain kind of spiritual force field when we behave that way, when human beings behave that way. Beshegam hu basar. So I'm translating this in as much as he is flesh. Now the point of this is interesting. He says kamo shegam. It says beshagam in the Hebrew, and he says you could read it as if it says beshegam besagol with the s sound. Klomar, and what this means is bishvil shegam zot bo, in as much as this is to say, in as much as this too is part of him, shehu basar, that he is flesh, and I've got to keep going for you to get the point here. V'afal pichen, and despite the fact that he is only made out of flesh, he's only a flesh and blood creature, eino nichna, he does not submit lefanai, before me. He doesn't submit himself before me. Uma im ye'esh, what would have happened were he made out of fire, or davar kasher, or something much harder, much more durable? In other words, we know that flesh rots, okay? And nevertheless, human beings are stubborn, and they resist God, and they don't want to do it. Ain't no one gonna tell me what to do, right? Okay? So, this is so when it says beshagam hu basar, what Rashi's explaining to us is God is saying, look at this. Human beings made out of flesh, and look at how they're behaving. Huh. Can you imagine? Okay. And then Rashi goes into some other stuff where he gives examples where the grammar is such. So I don't know that that's so important for us to do. Here we go. So let's
It's
see.
10:03, Rabbi.
Okay. All right. So here is this thing about his days will be 120 years. So let's see if there's anything there. We'll continue tomorrow and take a look at that 120 years that Rashi talks about here. So we'll pick it up here tomorrow. And I'm going to stop the share and thank those who have been following, and I hope they've enjoyed it. And please God, continue tomorrow.